the mask can be an incredibly powerful tool for a wrestler. If used right, in fact, it can help to add a lot of extra character and flair to someone's gimmick. But not all masks are created equal. No, some are so bad that they end up making the wrestler wearing them plummet down the card. But which are the worst of them all? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at today. So join us as we take a deep dive into Dire Disguises, wrestling's worst masks. And if we're going to start anywhere, let's do so with a truly terrible example of a mask. If this one even counts as a mask, that is, because in truth, when Chainsaw Charlie debuted in 1997, all he had to cover his face with was a pair of pantyhose. Yes, looking like a B-tier bank robber, Terry Funk's return to New York at the beginnings of the Attitude Era wasn't exactly what most people would have expected ahead of time. After all, this was the former NWA World's Champion and a bona fide living legend. That said, for as much as fans adored him, Vince McMahon was concerned the Funkster just didn't have enough star power to stand out in New York anymore come the turn of the millennium. And so that was why, when the idea was floated to bring him back, the boss felt a change in gimmick was necessary. This wasn't Terry Funk anymore, you see. No, it was a completely new character named Chainsaw Charlie, one who'd never been found in a WWF ring. The only problem was fans immediately saw through the thin layer of nylon covering his face, and so were able to identify him for who he really was. And it wasn't just them who did this either. Even commentary were quick to tell those watching at home the man they were seeing before them was actually the Amarillo Legend. So that was why, after only a brief period of trying to disguise himself, Funk eventually dropped the mask altogether and reverted back to his real self. Of course, this turned out to be a wise move in the end, because for the next few months, we were able to get middle-aged and crazy Terry in a WWF ring, taking on the likes of his old friend Mick Foley in hardcore brawls. Sure, it would have been better had he just done this right from the start, but even during its most popular boom period, the New York territory was far from perfect. And if you want any further evidence that the Attitude Era wasn't a stranger to other notable mistakes, you only have to look at Golga and the all-time bad mask he wore as part of the oddities. But what makes this one all the worse isn't just the mask itself. No, it's the fact that, like with Terry Funk and Chainsaw Charlie, the man underneath it was already a WWF legend anyway. That's right, while at first glance he may have just appeared to be a fat guy in an Eric Cartman t-shirt, in truth, Golga was actually the former Earthquake. So why wasn't he brought back as his old gimmick then? Well, the answer to this question, perhaps unsurprisingly, lies with Vince McMahon. Basically, by the time 1998 rolled around, he thought the fans wouldn't recognize the Canadian star anymore, given the weight he'd lost, and on top of that, he didn't think the Earthquake gimmick held much nostalgic value anyway. But what did hold value, at least in his eyes, was a member of a freak show who adorned his face in a poop brown mask. And that was why John Tenta's big return to New York ended up happening in the most under-the-radar way imaginable, as he spent the next couple of years doing little of note other than middling about in the mid-card and occasionally taking part in some dancing. It's just a shame his dancing wasn't very good then, certainly not enough to earn him a spot on the dance break team of our next subject, but when it came to Carmella in 2021, she had much bigger problems to deal with anyway, in the form of a truly terrible mask of her own. Yes, it's easy to forget, but for a brief period, the Staten Island Princess was in fact a mask wearer, as, after she returned from a brief hiatus at the beginning of the 2020s and started to refer to herself as the most beautiful woman in the world, she decided she needed to protect that face of hers at all costs. How would she do this? Well, by popping out a bejeweled disguise and using it to keep herself protected from any errant punches or kicks. That said, while this might have been a good idea in theory, the fact the mask itself looked so ridiculous kind of put a damper on it right away. But at least it seemed to help her in the ring somewhat, as not long after the whole gimmick began, both she and Zelina Vega briefly became women's tag team champions together. It's just a shame this run didn't last longer then, as come the time of WrestleMania 38 the following spring, the champs would have lost their gold to Sasha Banks and Naomi, and after that, Carmella was turned on by her now former partner, leaving her to disappear from TV for a while, and her ill-fated mask to fall away to the ether forevermore as a result. Maybe our next subject should take some lessons from this then, as his mask has been an albatross around his neck ever since he started wearing it in 2022. That's right, it's time to talk about one of the worst gimmicks of the current generation, scripts. Who is Scripts? Well, He's Reggie. You know, the guy who debuted in 2020 as Carmella's personal sommelier, one who quickly found himself being exiled to the dreaded 24/7 title division from there. Needless to say then, if the Memphis native wanted to try and revive things after such a point, he was going to have to change things up dramatically. The only problem was the changes WWE creative team had in mind for him were to send him down to NXT and adorn him in the world's most budget-looking superhero costume. Of course, more so than the rest of the outfit, it was the mask which really stood out here, as with it fitting about as well as a king-size bedsheet on a camping bag, it was immediately impossible not to laugh at it. So perhaps it's just as well that following a loss to Axiom in May of 2022, Reggie would finally have his identity revealed to the world, to the shock of roughly no one. Yes, it wasn't exactly Peter Parker showing his face or Batman taking off his mask. Rather, it was something we all knew already and just wanted to get out of the way so we could move on to the next part of the story instead. Not that the next part of the story would be particularly good in itself though. No, since being demasked, Scripps has pretty much remained a glorified jobber. But at least he doesn't have to wear that awful looking face covering while he's doing this anymore. And that's not a luxury everyone has. Just ask the Shockmaster if you don't believe us. That's right, even to this day, if you show up at your local wrestling convention, you're liable to see Fred Ottman sitting at a booth with his sparkly painted Stormtrooper helmet in tow. Hell, it's become so synonymous with him at this point, he couldn't not bring it if he tried. But why is this mask so closely associated with the uncle of Cody and Dustin Rhodes at all? Well, that's because it's the one he was wearing at Clash of the Champions 24 when he infamously fell through a wall during what was supposed to be his big debut. Now, you all know the story behind this moment already, so we won't repeat it here, but what we will say is that perhaps the high point of the whole thing was Ottman's mask tumbling off his head mid-fall and revealing his face for everyone to see. That said, even if things had gone to plan here and he'd been able to keep his identity a secret, how in the hell was the Shockmaster supposed to get over as a serious threat anyway when his fearsome visage was nothing more than a modified piece of Star Wars memorabilia? Yes, it's the kind of thing most actually forget about the whole sad saga now, but it's true that such a gimmick was already destined for failure anyway. After all, it's not like sparkly helmets were all the rage for effective villains even back in the 90s. No, the likelihood is in a parallel universe somewhere where the former Typhoon managed to maintain his footing, he still doesn't find success with his new role, but instead just has to deal with the reality of actually wrestling while wearing the damn thing. And he wouldn't be the only one who had to worry about wrestling in an uncomfortable mask that he shouldn't have even been wearing in the first place, because a couple of years after that, in 1995 WWF, Al Snow was having to figure out a way of making Avatar work. But wait, who was Avatar again? Well, he was one of the Ohio natives' early gimmicks in New York, with this one being an attempt to capitalize off the success of the then massively popular Mighty Morphin Power Rangers franchise. How would that play itself out on screen though? Pretty badly as it turned out, because rather than just have him wear the mask the whole time, management made the curious decision to bring Snow out to the ring with his face exposed, only for him to then cover up once the bell rang. Basically, the idea was that, like with the Power Rangers, it was in part Al's costume which gave him his strength. So if he carried his mask down to the ring and only put it on prior to fighting, then it was essentially him giving himself a last-minute power-up. Sure, it was a terrible logic and one which even kids in the audience at the time saw through, but at least it explained why a man would only cover himself up at very specific intervals. And thankfully, it's not like the whole Avatar gimmick ended up doing lasting damage to Snow's career in the long run anyway, because come 1997, he'd have returned to ECW, where he'd there reinvent himself as his most popular incarnation, a man who spoke to a polystyrene mannequin's head. How did this ever get over? Well, you have Paul Heyman to thank for that, just as you have Paul Heyman to thank for our next entry, Just Incredible, having a career revival after going through a terrible spell in the mid-90s WWF as the woefully masked performer, Aldo Montoya. But where do we start with this one? Basically, in 1994, Peter Polacco was hired by WWF, and when asked about what kind of history he had in order to come up with a gimmick for him, he mentioned that he was of Portuguese ancestry. So at this point, rather than try and do something cool with such a concept, McMahon felt the best way to go was to brand his newest superstar as Aldo Montoya, Portuguese Man of War. Unfortunately though, the WWF was unable to come up with many good ideas for this new character, as he would just end up being a lower card guy dressed in yellow, red, and green ring gear with one of the worst looking masks in the company history on his head. That's right, in a truly baffling case of mask design, this one really looked like more of a jockstrap than anything else. And that just made the Connecticut native look all the more ridiculous each time he came through the curtain. Hell, even his peers took to making fun of him backstage over the state of his gear, and for fans, they weren't any less harsh. So perhaps it should go without saying that this gimmick didn't really go far then, but how could it? It's not like a mask that bad was ever going to be featured in the main event of WrestleMania. No, all it was destined for was superstars at best. And this is exactly what led to the man behind the whole thing leaving the company altogether in 1997, and from there, somehow managing to revive his career in a certain Philadelphia-based hardcore promotion. But not everyone has to go to Extreme Championship Wrestling in order to save themselves following a bad spell in New York. No, if you're the man behind the infamously bad Max Moon, then you actually have two choices: Philly or Mexico. Of course, the reason you'd have two choices here is because Max Moon was actually portrayed by two different people over the course of his run. That's right, early on, the gimmick had actually been created for Lucha superstar Conan as a way of getting him over with the American audience in a big way. But once the future CMLL World Heavyweight Champion caught sight of the absolutely atrocious getup he'd have to wear, one which came complete with a mask that looked like a dog's drawing of Buzz Lightyear, he quickly decided to get out of there and not have his good name sullied by the whole thing. And with Conan now gone then, it left WWF scrambling to come up with a replacement to take on the role at the last minute, a replacement they'd eventually find in journeyman performer Paul Diamond. Yes, not having the same power to make work for himself elsewhere as his Cuban counterpart did, Diamond was instead forced to bite the bullet and accept the role of Max Moon when it was offered to him later that year. And while such a role did give him plenty of exposure on TV, we're willing to bet he regrets the decision anyway, as all people think about when they think of his name now is that absolutely abysmal mask. Honestly, it's just so bad, and it wasn't just the mask either. No, it was the entire outfit in general, an outfit which was supposed to make him look like a man from the future, but instead just made him look like an embarrassment from the best forgotten past instead. So maybe this was why, during his 6-month or so long run in New York, Moon only appeared on one pay-per-view event when he took place in the 1993 Royal Rumble and was there eliminated in less than 2 minutes. But for as big of a kill shot as this was to his career, at least he was put out of his misery soon thereafter, as just 1 month later, Diamond was released from his contract and left to go try and rebuild things in ECW. And let's be honest, it wasn't like he was the only person in mid-90s WWF who had to deal with a terrible masked gimmick. No, you could argue there was one notable example which was even worse. Who are we talking about here? Why, who else but Mantar, of course. Yes, even now, almost 3 full decades later, it's impossible to forget the sheer horror that was this character. After all, it was supposed to be a wrestler who was half man and half animal. And while the idea of this is silly in itself, the execution somehow made things even worse, as every time he came to the ring following his debut in the summer of 1994, Mike Halak would be forced to wear the head and shoulders of a bull over his own. Truly, the fact this ever got to the point of becoming a reality is stunning, and a sign that WWF really was a dying brand for a while following the end of the golden era. But that's not even the worst of it, because so big was this bull's head Halak had to adorn himself in every night, it wouldn't even fit through the ring ropes. So before he ever entered the squared circle, the Omaha native was required to remove it while standing on the ring apron, something which only served to make the whole thing even more pointless. And it wasn't as if things got any better once the bell rang after that either. No, seemingly believing he was an actual bull, once things got started he'd take to charging, trampling, and mooing at his opponents during the course of the match itself. Fortunately though, after he left the WWF, Mike Halak would go on to some good things when he spent spells working for the likes of ECW, WCW, and the United States Wrestling Association. As for his time in New York though, well, outside of a brief return as a bodyguard for Goldust in 1996, that would be done and dusted. But it's not the same way for everyone who had a failed mask gimmick in WWE, because years after his brief run as the mysterious Quang, Savio Vega got a second, far more successful opportunity. That said, we are not talking about his time as the leader of Los Boricuas today. No, we're talking about his time between 1993 and 1995 as the... well, we're not sure what this one was supposed to be at all, if we're being honest. No, the best we can do is try and describe his look, with this being one of a man dressed in loose red pants and a mask which no one in their right minds would ever wear, even for the purposes of a dare. Why so? Well, it looked like Shredder from the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles meets a badly drawn Power Rangers villain. And as if that wasn't bad enough, it appeared to be hard to actually see out of. Still, if he wanted a role, then Savio Vega would have no choice but to go along with his boss's demands, and so that's why he played the character as asked during the doldrums of the New Generation era. But it wasn't all bad. He did get to share the ring with the likes of Bret Hart, Razor Ramon, and The Undertaker after all, and his commitment to the admittedly terrible role was enough to see WWF decide to finally rebrand him in 1996 when he, at this point, morphed into his more commonly known persona. So it just goes to show, if you're given something terrible to work with, some good can come out of it if you just commit as best you can. Sure, it may not make the role you've got at that particular moment in time any easier to deal with, but it might pay off somewhere else down the line. But what if the terrible masked gimmick actually comes after your big breakout character burns out? How do you deal with this knowing your peak has likely already come? Well, if you want an answer to that, you'd best look towards our next subject of today, Barry Darsow and his attempts to get the Repo Man over. Of course, older fans might be more familiar with Darsow under his original WWF moniker, that being Smash, one half and then later 1/3 of Demolition. But while Demolition largely dominated the tag team scene in New York throughout a significant period of the 80s, by the time the 90s rolled around, the sun had most definitely set on their time at the top. Why was this? Well, Axe was nearing retirement, and Crush was already on his way towards singles stardom in his own right. So realizing something new was going to be needed for the third member of the team as well at this point, Vince McMahon decided to rebrand him as the Repo Man in the summer of 1991. But who was the Repo Man exactly? Well, basically, he was what he said he was, someone who repossessed goods which hadn't been paid for, at least in a cartoon sense, with his trench coat covered in tire marks and mask which looked like it was ripped straight out of the Lone Ranger. He was more of a caricature than anything else. And sure, it also didn't help that he cackled out every word like he was Seth Rollins on crack, something which only served to make him seem less believable. That said, even if he hadn't been so overboard with the characterization, there still would have been the problem of that ring gear anyway. Particularly that mask, which was such an out-of-date reference by then, we wouldn't be surprised if not a single solitary person in the audience understood it. But then we guess each mask we've discussed today have their own major flaws, making them the very worst in wrestling history.